My brothers and sisters, welcome to episode number 137 in the Gospel of John. We're going to talk today about the first steps of unpleasantness. So get ready. We're in this narrative, this action-packed drama now. We're going to see some decisions by individuals, and it's kind of cringeworthy, really. Now, the reason we need to do the story is we need for Jesus to get arrested. We need for this horrible process to get started. We need the necessary binding that's going to happen to Jesus. We're going to see a necessary betrayal that's going to happen to Jesus. Read with me, open your Bibles. This is from John chapter 18. I'm going to start in verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Annas was a previous high priest. Verse 14, it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, so did another disciple, which is John. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, John, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, Peter says, "I am not." So now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming themselves. So we start this incredible narrative, this action-packed drama. We see these decisions by Peter. Now, first question, is it possible that the all-powerful Jesus is so weak to prevent his arrest? Can you arrest God? Can God be stopped? Can his liberty and sovereignty be interrupted? Answer is no, not unless he wills it and that he wants it. Now, this is quite the crowd. We have a band of soldiers, a cohort of soldiers, as the Greek word says, a captain and officers of the Jews. So we've got these spiritual and moral and legislative leaders, and then we've got the muscle. Now, this cohort, so it's a Roman term. It's a Roman term for 1,000 soldiers. So it's possibly the Jewish temple guard, but it's also possible it could be the temple guard and the Roman soldiers and a large group of Roman soldiers. Perhaps not 1,000 soldiers, but when they did things things in large numbers. So could it be that the Romans were here as well and looped into this kind of conspiracy? All right, so they arrested Jesus, and this cannot be done without his own volition. Remember, he told them, I'm going to lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me. I lay it down of my own accord. So in the garden, verse 3, Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, he comes forward and says, "Whom do you seek?" So Jesus literally leans into his arrest. And then the second thing he does is he prevents Peter and the band of disciples who had swords, some had swords, or at least Peter, prevents this from being a violent interaction. So Jesus comes forward to be arrested. It must happen. There's no other way to be saved. There's no other way to conquer death and sin. There's no other perfect sacrifice available for this. So the gospel, the good news, to step back, explains how mankind can be saved. It makes sense. And I've never heard another plan about, if you think hard as you can, how might God save it? I've never heard an alternative that made any sense. Only God could figure this out on how to save people. All right, so let's go to the physical part of this. Jesus is bound, and we're talking about eventually we're going to talk about Jesus, how he's physically insulted and spiritually insulted and relationally insulted. The first one here is this physical thing where he's arrested and he's bound. Let's not miss this. His liberty is arrested. And this is a very, very unpleasant thing. And there's much more unpleasantness to come. So the location that he takes him to, they go from Gethsemane to the house of Annas, who is the ex-high priest, the previous high priest. He's referred to as a high priest, just like we refer to Obama as president, even though he's not president anymore. So Peter and John followed Jesus. What happens to the other 9? They fled somewhere. John is known to the high priest. It says that twice here. So he kind of gets an entrance into this courtyard. And then Peter is outside the courtyard. John is inside the courtyard. John goes out and ushers him in. So it says that he went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. And then the servant girl says, "Are you not one of this man's disciples?" And he said, "I am not." So the first of Peter's betrayals is to a servant girl. Now, it's a female, number one. Number two, she's a servant. And number three, she's young. So the word here is not woman, mature woman. It's a young girl. So old enough to man a door, but not old enough to be called a woman. And it's this quick, unexpected, almost out of the blue. It's almost, if you would have told Peter a trumpet goes off and said, "You're going to have a betrayal temptation," he probably could have resisted it. So there's no indication that he is aware of the betrayal that is at his hands. Jesus is aware of this, but I don't think Peter is just yet. So now we have to know that this horrible event happens to Peter, not just for his education and his affirmation eventually. Otherwise, God wouldn't have gone to such great trouble to put it into our Bible. So, Peter starts out well, and then he fails. We know how this ends. We're screaming off the pages, "No, Peter, don't deny Jesus. Don't deny following Jesus to the servant girl," and we shouldn't either. And then there's one final detail, which is cold enough to require a fire, which is, kind of interesting just for detail. All right. So thank you for being here to hear these first steps of unpleasantness. Today we have a necessary arrest. We have a necessary binding and even a necessary betrayal. So keep in mind that this unpleasant story, that's how we get saved. Thanks for listening. Come back tomorrow.